Hi, this is Cheryl Zwalji from Astral Connections again, and here with me I have Dell Coleman. Let's find out who Dell Coleman is. I might need some help with that, Dell.
Yeah. Well,
Tell us a little bit about your life first. Tell us a little bit about
Okay.
where you grew up, and to give a framework of a starting point.
Okay. I grew up in eastern part of Canada in Ontario. Grew up in Hamilton, in fact. And I spent the greatest part of my life around that area between Hamilton, Toronto, in places in between there. It was a great place to grow up in many respects because although Hamilton is known as a steel town and not the greatest place necessarily.
Very industrial, right?
Quite industrial, yeah. It has a huge amount of park space and access to a lot of nature from there. So, yeah, in that respect, it was pretty good.
Did you go on many nature walks?
Yeah. The Niagara Escarpment runs through that whole area. So, in those, when I was living there, they built ski hills up against the escarpment, and there used to be every once in a while enough snow, mostly in the winter. There used to be enough snow to be able to ski on those hills. And, it was pretty good. And it's right up against Lake Ontario where you could, you could swim in that lake then. You'd probably swim in it now, but in between it's, it's gone bad and gotten better. So,
yeah. A lot of lakes have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a good thing happened to it, so.
Yeah.
It got better, yeah.
So tell us a little bit then about your childhood and what your aspirations were and what you wanted to do and as you were growing up.
I came from a family of, I have three brothers, or actually 2 brothers and a sister, so there's 4 of us all together. And my mother, who was kind of a strong influence, always said, make sure you get a trade, and if you get a trade, then you've always got something to do. Right. Fortunately, I didn't listen to her.
Fortunately or unfortunately?
Fortunately, I didn't listen to her. I went to university instead and became involved in computer science. Got a background in, my university training is in geography and computer science, which turned out to be a great combination because as I was coming out of my work for the government, I worked for them for a number of years, probably 15 years. We're just coming into a consulting environment where mapping and computers had come together into digital mapping. And pretty much all of the mapping.
What would be our modern day Google Maps?
Yeah, well, without the stuff we did back then, there wouldn't be Google Maps today.
Yeah.
So I worked on a big old project called Canada Land Inventory for, in part, a bunch of land inventory projects for. I worked for Environment Canada at that time, and mostly for them I did research work of one sort or another, or some kind of computer work. Generally in those days computer modeling, because people were trying to understand all sorts of environmental issues, and they didn't really have.
So when you say computer modeling, like AutoCAD?
No, more like simulation models would be a more general term, I guess. Right. And because they had these issues and they couldn't actually go and play with the environment, they had to do it in a way where there wasn't an impact, and that was computer modeling instead. So there were fairly big budgets at that time and lots of interesting problems to work on. So mostly I went to work and had fun.
National problems, global problems?
Well, yeah, they were fairly. There were some international problems we worked on. Some of the projects were for the International Joint Commission, Canada-U.S. Boundary water, boundary pollution type of projects. So. And I was looking back just a few days ago. One of those projects which I did early on was a forecast from 1976 to 2020 of some pollution things that were that they wanted to project in those days. And so we still have 7 or 8 more years to go to get to the forecast date. So we don't know that.
So we don't know what's going to happen yet.
Yeah, I've been wanting to find that report, but maybe I'll find it one of these days and see how we did.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Yeah. After a point, I left the government, went to do environmental consulting type work. That involved, mainly we were doing geographic information system type work, computerized mapping, and environmental analysis work for clients. And so I did work for a number of big clients at that point.
So coming from the metaphysical world, I tend to want to ask you if you used any dowsing equipment at that time.
Well, no. That was before my days of metaphysical, so I was strictly left brain and kind of just normal everyday guy. Nothing very open or spiritual about that. So yeah. Anyway.
So what took you then from that normal everyday guy to the metaphysical world?
To getting here?
Yeah.
Well, in 1997, I went to Victoria to work on a project for the Ministry of Forests, and I worked with a couple of Oriental guys who kept saying things which were pretty strange. So one day,
for example,
well, I can't remember what they said that was strange, but there was a lot of things that were said that were strange. And I asked myself the question, what do they know that we don't know? And the answer to that was huge, because it was almost everything.
Right.
So it basically opened up the metaphysical, but it opened up my interest in all kinds of Oriental knowledge, so yoga, Japanese, Chinese cultures, and a whole big area.
And you delved in.
Yeah. So the way I actually got into the metaphysical side was through some martial arts training, which I was older at that stage and really didn't want to go doing karate all that much. So I would focus on Tai Chi and Qigong, and those are both internal energy type of exercises, and so then it tends to open up your energy, and you understand that there's more than physical.
Right. How long did you do that for?
Well, I did that kind of training for probably 4 or 5 years in Victoria mostly.
Structured or
yeah, I took classes with teachers at that time. Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah, a little fellow called Tech Xia, Master Tech.
Master Tech.
Master Tech.
Coming from the tech world, that must have been.
Well, no, but you see, it was interesting because he was 45 or maybe getting on 50, and he'd been doing martial arts stuff for 20 years, and he didn't really consider himself to be a master, so we started to call him Master Tech, and he would be quite indignant about that. Right. He wasn't the master of that. And it took maybe a couple of months of us calling them that until he finally said, well, I guess I am. And after that he was. So, but yeah, I learned a lot of, he taught Chinese arts, and so I took Tai Chi and Qigong with him, but also Lock Up and a bunch of really strange things called 9 Palace and 7 Star and
okay, now I want to know what those are, because I don't know.
All of those kind of things. So,
can you speak a little bit about them?
Well, Lock Up or Yuhu Bafa, which I probably totally mispronounced, is a martial arts form that's very much focused around moving from the waist. It's similar to another Indian form that I can't remember right now. But anyway, those other forms are kind of components or pieces that you can fit. You can make whole martial arts out of those patterns, I suppose.
Okay.
Right. Yeah, I took an interest in Japanese martial arts as well, and went off to learn Japanese sword, which turned out to be the thing that was neat about that. Okay, so the particular martial art was the art of drawing the sword called Iedo. The whole martial art is a draw and 2 cuts with a sword. And some katas. That's all there is to that thing. Which, I mean, it's big, but
Yeah.
I mean the foundation is just that small amount of stuff, which expands. But the thing that I learned out of that whole process was that stuff is just basically meditation. Right? It's a form of meditation, and so
So
then
as you're moving,
learned
you're meditating, basically.
it's a moving meditation, yeah.
Right.
And so it turned out that all of the other Japanese forms of archery and flower arranging and all of those kind of things that they're fond of are actually meditations.
Yeah.
And there's some level where it's flower arranging, but there's another whole different level where it's
So
you
that's,
get out of the way and you let the universe do its thing.
so that's like the cutting the bonsai tree and all that as
Yeah,
well,
the bonsai tree. Then all of that stuff that the Japanese do are pretty much meditations, whereby if you do that and you get out of the way, then the universe can
open up to
open
you.
up to you. Yeah, exactly.
Hmm.
So, yeah, that was one direction. Now, the other direction of getting in was through a science group that I got involved with. I was hanging around on the internet with half a dozen guys looking for.
So how does a karate person who's involved with a karate group get involved with a science group?
Well, this one was, it kind of was intellectual, just from the perspective that it was pretty clear that what they were telling us from the science perspective was not what the real answer was. And so we decided we'd go find the answer. And guess we probably did.
Wow. So elaborate a little bit then. How did you meet them?
Well, yeah. Well, these were half a dozen people that were hanging around in groups. Hamel Tech was one of them, and COSO groups were another. This fellow COSO,
There's the word tech again.
yeah. Well, I mean, it's sort of. It's not our technology. It was technology, but it wasn't from here. So this fellow Kosal was Filipino. He was metaphysically hooked up with he said he was hooked up with Syrians. So and they had given him some devices, and these people were messing around with these devices. So they were basically
Syrians
circular.
as in the planet Sirius?
Yeah, that's how it's Sirius, yeah,
Okay.
not Syria. Right?
Okay.
But anyway, I mean, that's his story, so
Okay.
I can't argue with his story,
No.
right? So,
But there's probably some merit
But-
to what he had to say regardless
well,
of his story.
there was technology that was different. So, what he had was sets of spheres that were in platonic form shapes, which means either triangles, octahedrons, dodecahedrons,
Yeah.
right? The shapes of Plato. And these things had magnets attached in places here and there, and they were meant to be spun, and they were meant to interact with each other. And so they could generate fields and forces and do different things. Now, the place where you'd see the best example of this kind of stuff is in the movie Contact with Jodie Foster. If you look at that machine that's in the Contact movie, that thing is very much in the flavor of the stuff that he was getting from these folks. Yeah. The Hamel group was involved with a Canadian guy. His name was David Hamel. He died 4 or 5 years ago, something like that. But in the 70s, around that time, he lived in Maple Ridge, and he had a story about being abducted or being taken on a ride in a ship. He learned a bunch of things from that, and this group was mainly just about discussing what he learned, the kind of devices.
Analyzing it. Okay.
Right. And the beings that he encountered in that basically said to him that that technology was available in Egypt, and so he had quite a connection with the papyrus of the Book of the Dead, and he marked up a whole bunch of documents of correspondences that he had learned or they had told him about.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And did you get an opportunity to go through some of this stuff?
Well, there's a lot of that material posted on the internet.
On the
I mean,
web,
it's
yeah.
sort of obscure and you have to spend time with it. But in the spring of 2000, I decided that I would go to Ottawa to see my son, and it turned out that this fellow had actually moved some years ago to Ottawa. In the Ottawa area. He was probably 100K outside Ottawa, but on my way back over to Toronto to head west, I decided I would stop in, yeah. So I just phoned him up out of the blue, and he said, yeah, okay, come over. And it was actually a pretty interesting conversation, because I think a lot of times people just showed up on his doorstep, really didn't have a clue. They were looking for some kind of magic answer, but it was a bit different to find somebody who'd actually read his stuff and kind of understood what he was talking about.
Okay.
Now, I had another purpose for going there. In this group that we'd found, I'd run across another Canadian, a guy named Wilbert Brockhouse Smith, and there's a science fiction writer called Wilbur Smith, and that's not the same guy. But anyway, this guy Wilbert Smith, he wrote a little book called The New Science, which is on the internet. It's in a PDF. You can read it. It's about 79 or 80 pages. What this guy Wilbert Smith did, he was an engineer with the Canadian Government Department of Transport. He ran what amounted to the first Canadian UFO monitoring station.
Oh, interesting.
It's up in Bell's Corners on the Ottawa River, and there's an archive in the University of Ottawa Library where a whole bunch of secret documents, all of this documentation about the stuff was secret at the time it was being done, and it's been released, and it's in that archive. So one of the other purposes in going to visit, other than going to visit my son, who was there
Right.
at the time, I wanted to look at that archive and see what information was in there. So now, in talking to this fellow Hamill, I mentioned to him that I'd been to Ottawa to look at this Wilbert Smith archive, and he said, "Oh, I know Wilbert Smith. I used to work for him years ago on the Dew Line project." So, yeah, there was some kind of
synchronicities.
well, I think he was
that.
selected. Yeah,
Okay.
I think Hamill got selected to go for his ride.
Right.
Anyway, yeah. So out of the work by Wilbert Smith.
Wilbur Smith, yeah. I'm gonna have to go and read this now.
Well, it's pretty difficult because he
Very mathematical?
No, it's not mathematical, but all of the good stuff is hidden. So he wrote it so that you could read it, but you wouldn't necessarily understand it. So,
Oh,
and he makes a
interesting.
big point about understanding. So you have to spend some time to
I have a
understand.
good friend
so.
named Dell that can help me understand it, though.
Probably. Yeah. So it was an understanding of this this work of Wilbert Smith's that allowed us to make some progress in understanding how things are organized and how the metaphysical is structured now. It turns out that people have known this for quite some time, and there are certain pieces of information that are out, and it's more or less couched in terms
Okay.
that if you know what they're talking about, you understand it. If you don't know what they're talking about, so
It's like,
you
it's
can't
like
get to
many
understand
It's
it.
like the many meanings in scripture sometimes, right?
Exactly. But if you don't understand what they're talking about, then what they're really meaning, then you won't understand what
It's
they're talking
gibberish
about.
then, yeah.
Right. So you don't have the framework to put it in context without the framework. So it's only when you get the framework then you can go back again and say this fits here and that fits there. Here's how all the
Fascinating.
pieces come together. Yeah. And so this, in the metaphysical world, there's lots of information. But the thing is scattered, and
Yeah.
it's not put together in one place.
So do you feel you've been able to put it together?
Well, I have a view
I had to ask.
Yeah, I know. I have a view that I like, so I have my
Care
story.
to share it?
Yeah, it's a bit of a process.
Somehow I didn't doubt it was.
Yeah. Okay, so the distinction is between being and doing. Right?
Okay.
And so the problem we have is that most people are involved in doing, which takes you away from the process of being. Right? Okay.
Right.
And so in order to move from, what we want to do is we want to move from doing to being.
Something tells me hours and hours of meditation is a key factor in this.
Yeah, meditation probably would be a good thing, but there's several factors, I think. One is that you need to be able to still a mind. The Zen people who talked about stilling the mind were totally correct. So
Yeah.
if there's constant mind chatter, then you can't be being because you're being distracted. Right? So another is that you need to, and another place where the Zen people were right is that you need to give up attachment. And so if you're attached to the outcome, then you're attached to the how, which is attached to the doing. And so you're not being. And attachment is really a form of doing.
And then consequences occur too.
Right, and there's all of that kind of stuff, right? But
Yeah.
the fact is that you're just not being anymore because you've wandered yourself back into a form of doing that's sort of more subtle.
So what about this whole idea of the secret then and manifesting, and how do you manifest without doing?
Well, that's the subject of our talk.
Exactly. Okay.
December the 27th?
7th, yeah.
7 p.m.
Yeah, 7 p.m.
Astral Connections.
Yeah. Tell them a little bit about what you think,
Okay, well.
what Think and Grow Rich Understood is all about.
Well.
Why do you think you understood it?
All right. With that kind of background, which isn't very much background,
Without giving too much away.
No, it's Napoleon Smith wrote the book in the 20s. He wrote it on behalf of Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie, who was the richest man in the world at the time. And it turns out,
That's
I
how to win
believe,
friends and influence people or something.
that's
He wrote
Dale.
That's Dale.
Yeah, it's the other Carnegie.
Okay.
So anyway, it turned out that he was telling too many stories in there, upset Henry Ford, and Henry Ford bought all the books up and burned them all and rewrote it so it's watered down. Right? So we're just kind of taking the water out of the watered down a little bit. So Think and Grow Rich is about using the power of it's being versus doing. Okay, and so you have to get more on the being side and less on the doing side. So work is a doing, think is a being, right? A beingness, and by thinking, then we come to attracting, and then we get to grow rich. So yeah, it's a short story.
I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, it'll be fun. All of the elements that you need to know are actually in his book. There are some elements that you don't need to know.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there are elements that are the stuff that goes beyond what you need for kind of basic thinking. Right?
Okay.
And that.
So what about the idea that, well, I don't know, but if I'm going around manifesting material things, am I not focusing on the spiritual things?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, that's actually a good question. I guess the answer to that is that there's a a gradation or a realm, a variation, whatever you want your word for. I mean, we go from the physical into the etheric, into the less etheric, into the less etheric, right? And it kind of goes around where you want to put your attention. Although there's another book by another guy called Wallace Wattles, another fellow, Wallace Wattles.
The Science of Money or something like that?
The Science of
Being rich or
being
becoming
rich. Or becoming rich,
Yeah.
something like that. And what he says is that we all deserve to be rich because we need money here, and it's only when we have money we can go do the things that are going to develop us spiritually.
Mm-hmm.
And so I kind of like this point of view. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, reading Think and Grow Rich and his, I preferred his actually.
Yeah.
The Wallace one.
Well, there's
But
some,
I don't know why. So
there's some things that we can discuss a little more. That I'll
course?
discuss a little more in the
course?
in the talk. Yeah, of
Okay.
course. And I'll talk a little bit about Wallace Wattles too, because he has some pretty interesting things to say. Wallace comes from the perspective that when you create things, whatever you get doesn't have an impact on anybody else. It doesn't take anything from anybody else.
So matter manifests.
It's a creation that's new, right? It's not taking something from someone else. Whereas when we're in the work world, it's oftentimes it involves taking something from someone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Reallocation is a nice work word for that, right?
Right.
Reallocation of resources is kind of take something from somebody, give it to someplace, take it from somewhere, put it somewhere else, take it from
Right.
someone, give it to someone else, right?
Right. And in
In
this
Waddle's
case,
scheme,
that
he
doesn't happen.
Yeah, he doesn't do that. He talks about manifesting directly,
Right.
and it's your stuff and it's nobody else's, right? So,
Unless
and
you decide
the
to
great
share
part
it.
about that is that everybody can do that for themselves, and yeah, you can share it if you want to.
Yeah.
But that there's no it's not a zero-sum game, right? There's no winners, there's no losers, everybody's the winner, and it's kind of the path into abundance, so.
Did you implement it yourself?
Yeah. Well,
Did you succeed? I have to ask.
Well, yeah, I think I did pretty much my whole life, actually.
So we're getting the information from the right person then.
Well, it's in a way that I didn't really expect or kind of understand, but when I talked about doing my work and going off to do my computer stuff and the research, and so that's all stuff I loved. Right?
Yeah.
And so every day I went to work, I went and had a great time. They paid me to have fun.
Right.
I love to do my work. And the money came in. I got really well paid for this stuff.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, had a bank account and house and wife and kids and car and all that kind of stuff, everything except the dog. I never worked a day in my life because every day I had fun, except with the exception of 2 or 3 years, but we won't talk about those. Anyway, at this point now, then, understanding this more, then, I mean, the only way to really approach this is from that perspective that you want to attract.
You want to be in a space of happiness, basically.
Right. Yeah, you have to do it from a perspective where you're happy and you're okay.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, I've exhausted my questions. Do you have any? Anything you want to share with the audience?
I don't have questions particularly, but if folks would like to show up on December the 27th at 7 o'clock, well, they can grow rich.
Okay. Thanks, Joe. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.